Hi, I'm Jen Trechek.
And I'm Dr. Onyudi.
And welcome to Season 6 of the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast. This season, we're focusing on occupational therapy in physical health. OTs play a crucial role supporting people to recover, adapt and return to the occupations that matter most.
We'll be exploring real-world practice, innovation, challenges, and the evolving role of occupational therapy across physical health services in Ireland and beyond.
So whether you're a clinician, a student, a user of services, or just passionate about occupational therapy, we're glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast. Our guest today is Mary McCarron. Mary, you're so welcome. We'd love to hear a little bit about you and your experience because you work in a very unique area of occupational therapy.
Yes, hello, how you doing? Thank you so much both for having me here. So I am a director of ConnectNeurotherapy Services, which is a small neurological occupational therapy practice based in England. I came to occupational therapy through slightly unconventional means. Thank God for UCAS clearing back in the day. That was how I got into it. So more by luck than anything else. And I worked, first of all, when I first qualified over in England, worked in sort of band 5 NHS rotational post, and then knew that I really wanted to specialise in neuro, and so kind of set myself up to do that really in band 6 and so on. Moved out of Oxford, went to London to the big smoke, left the man behind and went to work in the Royal Hospital for Neurodisability in Putney, and sort of really founded all of my neuro skills in my next couple of jobs in the community, rehab, all of that. And then went out into independent practice in 2013 full time, and then 2016 went alone, as they say, fully independent after my first maternity leave. There's nothing like a wee challenge. And here we are now. I don't even know how many years on, and ConnectNeurotherapy Services is happy, is thriving. We're a small team. We specialise in neurological rehabilitation, a lot of brain injury, spinal cord injury. Most of our caseload is medico-legal, so either people that have a settled case or they're still in that live litigation situation. And it's varied, it's really varied. We deal with everything. A lot of people on our caseload have complex neurobehavioural presentations. And then I also work as an expert witness just in the field of assistive technology, which is a really interesting sort of contrast, if you like, because obviously as an expert witness, my duty is to the court, whereas in my treat and occupational therapy, my duty is to the client. So yeah, it's an interesting mix.
That's really interesting. And I know when I was training, neuro kind of felt a little bit like the Rolls Royce of OT. You had to be really, really good and really specialist to go down a neuro route. Is that true? Is it very difficult to get into? Is it very specialised?
I think, Jen, it's obviously it'd be lovely to stand and say we are the Rolls Royce. I don't think it is that. I think what makes it difficult to get into is obviously there are fewer jobs in that specialty, and that can make it a bit difficult to get into. But I think any occupational therapist with a good sort of base of those core OT skills can be a neuro occupational therapist. It is a bit more difficult to get into, I think, purely based on the availability of the jobs. And that was one of the reasons I moved to London, because in the trust in Oxford that I was working in, there was very little movement out of those specialist posts. And so I went and sought that post out. It is specialised. And like I said, within my caseload, I can touch on everything from, adaptations, equipment, wheelchairs, cognition, upper limb. There really is a huge variation. But I think any occupational therapist with the interest in it and the tenacity to find that job can absolutely do it.
Mary, can I ask you a real kind of technical question now, right? Okay. When you said the word neurobehavior, that you see a lot of complex neurobehavior presentations, for anybody that might be listening to this, but maybe where neuro rehab isn't their background, what do you mean by neurobehavior?
So it's in our case that we see people, and it's typically people with a brain injury, who are not able to regulate their emotional, psychological, behavioral responses to external or internal stimuli any longer. So sometimes that can sort of present itself in a broad variety of behaviors. We don't like using the term challenging behavior for lots of reasons, but it can be things, it can be everything from withdrawal and, sort of disengaging. It can be quite destructive behaviors, reliance on alcohol or drugs. It can be aggression towards people, towards objects, towards themselves. And it's sort of really founded in that cognitive and sort of personality changes that happen after brain injury.
Okay.
And would the client themselves be looking for occupational therapy, or would it be more the families or carers, or I know you mentioned medico-legal, which I think might be a little bit separate, but do you find people who've experienced neurological challenges, traumas, coming themselves looking for OT?
Yes, more and more, Jen, I would say. In England, particularly at the minute, the statutory services and the rehabilitation and the neurotherapies that are being offered to people are just less and less and less. So we do see more and more people coming through and contacting themselves. And, that's for everything from functional neurological disorder, strokes, brain injuries. The majority of my caseload is often a case manager who's been appointed by a solicitor to when there's a medical legal case, when there's, sort of a personal injury or medical negligence claim, something like that. So it's usually a case manager in those instances that will come to us. Sometimes the solicitor will come directly. But yeah, so it can come from any place really. I would say I have had a couple where it's been the client themselves. Usually that's somebody with MS or Parkinson's, or like I say, somebody with FND just recently. But mostly it will tend to be the people around them, whether that's professionals or family.
It is. It's really interesting when you describe it, and when you describe that piece on the impact of a brain injury, cognition on behaviour. What then, Mary, or could you tell us about some of the typical interventions that you deliver to support people at home or in the community?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so varied, Anya. It really is, and that's a kind of a lazy answer in some ways, isn't it? But if I think about my typical week, I work with adults. I don't, or young people who are just transitioning out of pediatric services, sort of 16 onwards. And some of my clients, a lot of them actually are, they're mobile, they've got good use of their upper limbs, but they've got significant cognitive communication impairments. So it depends really on what it is, where they're at in their rehab journey and what their priorities, what it is they're working towards. Sometimes it is just managing everyday routines at home, personal care, meal prep, those sorts of things, and the cognitive infrastructure that goes around those sorts of things, memory strategies, problem solving strategies, keeping people safe, those sorts of things. And other times it can be right at the other end of the scale where we're getting somebody back to work, and that job could be everything from practice as a GP to running a care agency, estate managers, quite manual and physical jobs. It really is so, so broad. With some of those clients with the neurobehavioural presentation, that really needs a very comprehensive and really well consolidated MDT approach, where you're working with psychology, you're working with OT, SLT, the case manager, everybody, to try and work with the client to sort of understand the behaviour in the first instance, and then try to support them and provide the rehabilitation. And sometimes you're fighting big fires in that world, big risks. And sometimes it's more low level risks that can be easily managed.
The risk in relation to physical health has come up a few times in the series, and the OT's kind of role working alongside the client to balance autonomy and independence versus the risk of further injury or safety. And then you throw in that word medico-legal, and my kind of risk threshold goes, I get terrified at the idea of there's an additional layer there. How do you balance that? How do you manage that?
I think as a treating therapist, that's so easy because and this is probably, this could be the undoing now, girls, but you kind of just ignore that. It's nothing to do with you. As a treating therapist, your duty and your duty of care, your duty is to the client. They are at the centre of everything you do. And I have had cases where solicitors like to have a good old hook and poke and maybe try to steer a wee bit what the therapies are doing by way of supporting the legal situation. I'm not suggesting that they would try to what's the word? Not deviate or influence the legal. I'm not saying that, but just it'd be good if this showed this kind of thing. And really and truly, you just have to be a bit like water off a duck's back. And yes, you've got to hear that, but your duty is to the client, and so it's quite easy. I think a lot of other occupational therapists, and I see this coming through in my supervisions with other therapists, they get a bit intimidated that somebody definitely is going to read their notes. When we're training and we're told your notes could be taken for evidence, they could be read at any time, all of those things. But when you're faced with your notes will be read and they will go to court, that can be really intimidating. Yeah, but I suppose that's just like any day at work. Anybody could be reading your notes.
Isn't it a lovely way to practice, though, of actually really putting occupation at the front and centre? Because your notes will be read, as you said. So actually your notes need to be constantly written from this occupational formulation perspective.
Yeah.
What does this mean for their identity, their needs, their strengths, their support?
Yeah. And I think you get much more astute at writing clear notes that are not ambiguous, notes that couldn't be taken into the witness box and sort of made a mess of, frankly. And that, I think, for me is where that expert witness work really complements my treating therapist work, because I have been to trial, I have had to stand in the witness stand and be cross-examined on my work. And you do different training courses and things like that for the expert witness stuff, which just hones those skills in writing clear, concise notes. Yeah.
You described two very different components of work, though. The piece of like your client from the GP practice to, an estate agent, to obviously more of that risk-based profile where it's neurobehavior. If we come back to the other cohort for a minute and looking at that neuro rehab for those clients, like you said, you do everything there. What's your approach to assessment with those clients?
With the vocational rehab clients?
Yeah.
And I think this is one thing that I've gone over time and time again on you as a business. Should we just do a one size fits all assessment or a one price fits all assessment? And we don't. We tailor the assessment to the person. And that's based on the quality of information we get at referral. So if we get good information, we can kind of talk it through, decide, right, this is where we need to start. Often those vocational rehabilitation clients will have been with us, through a rehab journey, and then they're ready to go back to work or they're ready to re-engage with their employer. So that makes that side of a wee bit different. But if they're coming to us straight away as a vocational rehab client and we don't know them, then it's like any other occupational therapy assessment, that lovely OT process with your information gathering, thinking about them as a person before they get to work that day, but then obviously thinking about the job as well, the job analysis, the site visit, the same constructs, but just in relation to work and alongside the person at home getting themselves ready for a day. So you kind of ride along in two lanes as opposed to just that person at home. It's probably not a very good explanation of it, is it? I'm thinking, would I refer to her now based on that? Probably not. But you have to find the right time to bring in the employer. You will need to do that, and to understand that person's job. But first of all, you have to understand that person and where they're at functionally, and what their strengths and weaknesses are. And there will be times when you have, nuances woven in, like a slightly patchy work history or a slightly dodgy relationship with an employer before the brain injury. Life happens, and you just have to have a big bucket ready for that and bring it all in your assessment and your sort of analysis of that person.
I remember in college having lots of kind of discussions around the difference between a compensatory approach and a kind of more of a rehab approach, and what route do you go down, and does that come into your work, or is that very outdated, that type of discussion?
Um, I don't know that it's outdated, Jen. I think they do over here. I mean, I haven't had a student now for a wee while, but I think they do still teach those frameworks. They've moved along a wee bit, I think. But I think it's still relevant, and it's relevant in the way in which you talk to your client and their family about the approach that you're taking. Um, and there is often a bit of let's compensate so that we can get to a place where then we can use a more rehabilitative approach, or the other way around, like we've kind of exhausted everything we can on the rehabilitative approach. So now let's bring in the compensatory approach. And I won't say that I never use those words with my clients. I do, because sometimes you need them to understand the angle and the approach at which you're taking. And particularly with somebody where there's lots of different goals, maybe, or goal areas, you might be saying to them, look, let's just park that in the lay-by for now, and we'll just use a compensatory approach for that for now. We'll focus on this goal, and then we'll come back to it. So I think, bear in mind I qualified back in 2002, I think that's still relevant and still should be relevant to our thinking, and how we help clients and their families to understand what we're doing.
There is the multiple stakeholders, isn't there, in your work? Because there is the client, but they're part of an ecosystem and a family with maybe similar but maybe different goals and aims of therapy. And then I guess you bring in the medical legal team as well. Does that ever come into conflict in terms of a family's needs or wishes versus a client's needs and wishes?
Yeah, I'd love to say it doesn't. I'd love to say that it doesn't, and it's all seamless and harmonious. It does, because I think as humans, it's, we, and particularly as family units, we want certain things for our family person. So it does come into play, and I think it's something that has to be really carefully managed. I say to people all the time, let's not put our values or even our hopes on this client. It's for him to or her to derive and to draw that out through the therapy that they're having. People need a bit of that because they need to know that they can achieve these things. But there are times, Jen, when there is a bit of conflict or a bit of a contradiction, if you like, between what the person wants to achieve and what their mum or their wife or whoever it is thinks that they should be achieving. And that's all right. I think that's human nature to an extent. I always try to think what I would be like if it were my husband or my son or whatever, or my mum. Yeah, I think it's difficult to manage, but you have to be ready to manage and to work with all of those people in that ecosystem, as you rightly say.
It's a real skill then in terms of the communication and the advocacy and the being able to take on board different perspectives, which, it sounds like you're really expert in.
Yeah, well, I hope so. And it doesn't ever go in one direction of travel the whole time. There'd be times when you might be saying, your daughter or your wife has made this point, and I think it's worth listening to that in this instance. And other times you can say, well, actually he thinks this, and it's not just one direction and on you go. It does it's about bringing all of those things together and holding all of that, and also as therapists, it's so easy to walk on set to this person's life and think, right, well, I know brain injury and I know rehab and I know this and I know that. So here we go, people. But actually, that person has lived a whole life. That family has lived a whole time before you've arrived on scene, as it were. And you have to look at that as well because it is relevant and it is important. How did this family do things before the injury? What are their values as a unit? What bits of that does this person really want to get back and need to get back? And what bits actually are not so much for them now?
When you describe that, Mary, it's a key theme that has come up across several of the podcast interviews in this season. That piece of how we listen to people. One of our first interviews is with Jack Kavanagh, and he spoke about the importance of OT and how effective OT is that person who really listens to the client to know what do they want to do.
Yeah. And I agree. I think as occupational therapists, we just see the world differently. You know, one of my favorite OT heroes, Dr. Kim Stewart, would say we just think differently. And we do, because we hear things that are often not said, or they're kind of whispered, if you like. We pick up on things. We see things from other people's perspective, whether it's the client or the family member or whoever it is. And it's unique, you know, that we can piece all of that together and do it so naturally. That's just part of our core work, isn't it?
What's your favourite part of the work, Mary? Do you love being in court or do you prefer the hands-on?
No. I have huge imposter syndrome about the expert witness work, Jen. It gives me the heebie-jeebies morning, noon, and night. I don't think I will ever roll in that world with any air of confidence about me. But there's something quite sadistic, I suppose, in a way that I actually quite like challenging myself. But it's probably not the bit of the job that I would naturally sort of lean to. For me, what's my favorite bit of the job? It's that I think it's that connection with people. Do you know that? It's that connection and being able to bring somebody to a place where you have a really good therapeutic rapport, where you can see them for who they are and what they want to achieve, and then help them in some small way, even if it is minute way, to achieve that and get a sense of themselves back. One of my clients, I was asking him for feedback a few months ago, and he said such a lovely thing. He said, "You help me to feel like I am capable. I can do things. You know, I spend so much of my week seeing the things I can't do, and then my session with you is like a big torch and all the things I can do." And I thought, God, that's really special. That's really lovely to have that. And that's what I love. I'm by nature really tenacious people. I'm not a no girl. I always say to people, the first no is just policy. Go again. And that's how I like to roll with my clients, you know. And I think sometimes as an occupational therapist, you can really use your skills to advocate and say, yeah, okay, so he's got visual impairment, he's got cognitive impairment, there's a reduced balance, but he used to love clay pigeon shooting. It's really important to him. So let's go, let's take him. And everyone around the table is like, oh, the OT has lost the run of herself, she's gone. But actually, when you bring that person to that really meaningful occupation, and like you say, Anya, you're putting occupation at the centre of it all again, you see a slightly different person to the guy who's had to stack cones on a table or, you know, do whatever reps he was doing in other sessions. And you see a blossoming of that person coming back, and that's a privilege. That's a real privilege.
You also see the benefits of it neurologically, because as you describe that, what I hear is that piece on purpose and meaning are some of the core elements that are going to enhance our mental health and well-being. So if I've experienced a brain injury and I am at greater predisposition of low mood, anxiety, emotional dysregulation, that piece on purpose and meaning is going to be really important for mental health.
Yeah, and we know more about that now, don't we? About the whole person rather than just these silos of physical and mental health. And I think we as OTs, I think we've kind of got we're a step ahead, aren't we? Because we already knew that. We're already trained in both. Like we're a step ahead. And so being able to use our occupational therapy knowledge and language and our experience and expertise to advocate why somebody should return or be given the opportunity at least to get back to doing something that's really important to them. It's a bit of a no limits card, isn't it? Like I can get them, we can do these things. Um, and I love that.
And is there a kind of a time limit in terms of how long you might be working with somebody, or a minimum or a maximum, or is it dependent on each person?
It's dependent on lots of things. The medical legal clients, when I'm doing the treatment work, they often will go on much longer than your statutory services or your inpatient rehabilitation sort of time frames. So you can work with people over quite a long period of time, and I'm talking sometimes even years. Um, Obviously, that is if they've still got goals and things that they are working towards, and they've still got a reason for having that therapy. And there have been times when, even though the litigation claim is still going, I've said, look, they've reached their goals. They're at a stage where they actually just need a break from therapy, or there's no occupational therapy goals at this moment. And that's not to say there won't be in the future, but for now, we're okay. So it's kind of, it really changes. And obviously, if you've got somebody who is self-funding, then that's a bit different, because very few people have got limitless means to pay for therapy. So that might be a time when you have slightly less time. But that I do have other clients. I've got one self-funding lady with spinal cord injury, and I go back to her when there's something very specific to address, like an upper limb or something to do with her driving or things like that. And so you can dip in and out as is needed for people as well. So that works well.
Super. Mary, it's just amazing. You could listen to you all day and wonder, how would you encourage anybody who's thinking about getting into neuro rehab? What would you say to that, OT?
I would say do it. Don't see it as this sort of elite world that you can't access. If you've already registered as an occupational therapist, or you're on your way to registering as an occupational therapist, you can be a neuro occupational therapist. There's no doubt about that. I think what I would say to people is get your grounding in, like in my day, it was that rotational post where you got experience in peds, in surgery, in neuro, vascular, all of them, you get really good grounding in, you get a really good understanding of the human body and all of that. Mental health rotations as well. And then you can specialize. A really dear colleague of mine, South African OT, said to me, she used to be my supervisor, and she said to me, you've got like 30, 40 years of this stuff. Like, there's no need to rush. Post-registration, you've got a long old road. There's no need to kind of achieve everything today. And I think that, combined with understanding that your competency is, it's a journey, right? It's not a destination. You're not going to wake up one day and be like, I am a fab neuro OT. And if you do, we're in bother. So think of it as a journey, and use your supervision to draw out what things you need to develop and what you want to work on and where your learning needs are. And I think so often nowadays people, even in statutory, even in private services, don't have the right supervision set up. And I know, Anya, that's something you're really passionate about as well, that we need to advocate for that, because you need that to draw out what your learning needs are and what you want to work to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
My mind is spinning off now into a new drama series, Occupational Therapy Expert Witness. Forget Magnum PI. We're putting you on the TV, Mary.
We're going to need a good deodorant, Jen. All right? The expert witness work is so interesting. And I do it only in assistive technology. I don't get into these big 90, 100 page reports. That just is not my jam. But again, I think we hold such a unique skill set to be able to to do that work, and don't underestimate your ability to do it.
Mary, thank you so much for giving us a tiny little bit of insight into the breadth of your work. We haven't even touched on the fact that you have set up and run your own independent practice. That's also such an achievement. Thank you for sharing things with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been lovely.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks both.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast.
Thank you so much for listening and for being part of our occupational therapy community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, subscribe and share it with a colleague and join the conversation.
We'd really appreciate it. We'll be back soon with more insights into occupational therapy and physical health. So until next time, take care.